I've been reading through hundreds of pages of documents that detail how some of the most destructive state-sponsored hacking groups do their jobs. These reports have a stunning amount of detail that show things like the offices that they work out of, the times of day that they work, and most importantly, they include detailed technical breakdowns of how they hack into stuff. These documents span the last 10 years, and the hacking techniques used by these different groups are really similar, and they haven't changed that much in the last decade. They all follow the same basic formula that I'm gonna break down for you. But while I was reading these documents, one word kept popping up in my mind over and over again. A word that was completely missing from all of these reports, that I couldn't wrap my mind around why it didn't show up in any of them. And that word is cloud.
But we're now 5 years later, and about 10 times as much traffic, and we're almost 100% in AWS, at nearly the same kind of cost profile as we were in our data center back in 2008.
Cloud computing has completely taken over the world in the last decade, but for some reason it appears to have zero representation in some of the most well-funded hacking groups on the planet. My name's Dylan, and this is my NahamCon 2022 talk.
Are you familiar with the Mandiant report?
I am.
They say that there are tens, if not hundreds, of Chinese hackers.
One of our intrusion responders saying we think North Korea hacked Sony.
Okay, before I go any further, I need to explain a couple of things. The type of hacking that's talked about in these reports is not the same type of hacking you'd expect to see in a bug bounty. In fact, the crazy thing is, the types of hacking these groups use is almost exactly one-to-one with what's out of scope for a bug bounty program. Those include two main elements: social engineering and lateral movement. See, if this box represents a company's network, bug bounties have you exclusively focus on the very perimeter of that box. So for example, there's a web server here that's running on the internet. A bug bounty may have that web server in scope, but you're usually not allowed to test what's inside the box. That includes employee laptops, build servers, Git servers, internal file shares, Active Directory servers. Those servers inside their network are usually the most vulnerable. There's an assumption that attackers won't be able to get inside the network, and so it's okay to leave those services less protected. But that assumption has been proven wrong again and again, mostly through social engineering.
The criminal hackers in this case used a variety of techniques, including email spear phishing, downloading malicious files and code onto Yahoo's networks.
If you spearfish an employee's laptop, you can get inside this company's network and give yourself access to all the build servers and Active Directory services and a plethora of other technologies that are ripe for the taking. But social engineering is almost always out of scope for a bug bounty. One of the best case scenarios for a bug bounty could be that you manage to get remote code execution on the web server. That would give you access to the inside network. But to use that access, to jump from this web server to another server inside the company's network, you'd have to use something called lateral movement, which is also almost across the board out of scope for a bug bounty. So the two main tools that these hackers use are the exact two main tools that bug bounties don't allow you to use. Okay, with that context, I want to take you back in time to the early 2000s. State-sponsored hacking groups were just starting to become popular, and if you responded to one of these incidents, you must have sounded like a crazy person if you tried to explain to people what you did for a living. Explaining that there were these state hackers that were breaking into our transportation companies and our technology companies and our financial services, that there were spies and espionage all over the place, but it was kept under lock and key because no company back then ever wanted to admit that they got hacked. You'd also probably be under a strict NDA preventing what you could say about these things. So with these restrictions in place, security consultants were kind of backed into a corner. They had to explain that these hacking techniques were easy to do and super common, but without revealing that there were state actors breaking into companies left and right. So to bring transparency to the space, in 2003, HD Moore open sourced the first version of Metasploit.
So the Metasploit framework, it's an exploit development platform.
Really what Metasploit is a exploitation framework.
The Metasploit framework has grown into what's become the most popular exploit toolkit and command and control platform that's available open source. The Metasploit framework was an attempt to show what these different hacking groups were capable of without actually showing what these different hacking groups were doing. And the steps that security consultancies follow with the Metasploit toolkit are very similar to the steps that these hacking groups follow. The first step usually starts with some form of social engineering. They get code execution inside the company network by sending a phishing email to someone. From there are usually dozens of services running internally that run arbitrary code as a function of those services. Those could include things like Jenkins, Tomcat, MySQL, Active Directory, and so many more. The Metasploit toolkit would allow you to take code that you were running on this person's laptop and jump into all of those other servers so that you could expand your footprint and maintain lots of persistence in this internal company network. Commodity off-the-shelf scripts that worked and still work to this day super well at jumping from one computer to another computer inside a network. Another word for this type of software is malware. Metasploit is a malware framework, and all of the state-sponsored hacking groups had their own malware frameworks. But this level of visibility didn't solve the problem. In fact, things kept getting worse. Hacking groups kept proliferating and breaking into more and more companies.
That the company had uncovered what he called a highly sophisticated, targeted attack directed against Google that compromised certain Google source code.
In 2010, Chinese state actors broke into Google, and someone named Dmitry, who's the co-founder of Crowdstrike, named this hack Operation Aurora. Reuters quoted Dmitry in saying, "Crowdstrike has not publicly shared details about this group because the firm makes money selling proprietary research to clients." That was the mindset in 2010, that all of the information about hacking groups was better off kept secret. But in 2013, that all got flipped on its head. A cybersecurity company called Mandiant did something that was unthinkable at the time. They published a 76-page document detailing exactly how one of these Chinese state actors functioned. And in addition to showing off their office spaces and their ISP, they showed exact phishing emails that were sent from the Chinese hackers to companies. Here is one of the crazier excerpts from one of these phishing emails. The email is sent to an employee, and the employee replies to the Chinese hacker saying, "Is this for real?" The Chinese hacker then replies, "It's legit," showing that their understanding of the English language was good enough that they dissuaded the paranoia of this employee, and the employee opened the attachment from this Chinese hacker. The report shows how their command and control servers are set up. It shows all of the domains that they registered and the timelines for when they used them. But most importantly, it showed strategy. This strategy was the exact same strategy that cybersecurity consultants were using. They got an initial compromise, usually through phishing, and then they used that compromise to move laterally to more servers and laptops internally, install persistence on those servers, and rinse and repeat until they finally got access to the data that they were looking for. This technique was so simple and so easy, most cybersecurity consultancy groups could reproduce it in just a couple of weeks for a client, but no one had an effective strategy to protect against it. In fact, to this day, this strategy still works on most companies.
If all our tools work against them and all their tools worked against us in cyberspace, Russia wins.
Okay, back to the report itself. This was incredible. No one had ever documented one of these state actors before, let alone in this level of detail. The New York Times ran a story on it, Forbes ran a story on it. This was big news in 2013. But more importantly, it changed the narrative for how we talk about these state actors forever. This company is still producing these reports on many different actors. Here's one from 2019. It's a different Chinese state actor, but that follows almost the same methodology as the first one. And it wasn't just China either. In 2014, Mandiant published a detailed report showing off how one of Russia's state actors functioned and operated. This report broke down all the different countries that Russia was hacking into. It showed the phishing emails that they used, and it even showed the times of day that they were most active, which exactly correlates with Moscow business hours. These reports feel like state secrets. They feel like I shouldn't have my hands on them. Like all of this information should be top secret, but it's not. These companies made these state secrets public, and their methodology followed the exact same pattern. Start with spear phishing and then move laterally and privilege escalate inside the company's network. These reports always felt like I shouldn't be able to read them. They felt like top secret documents that were never meant to be made public because they exposed in such great detail top secret state actors that were never meant to be public. Okay, here's where the story starts getting crazy. After the report in 2014 about the Russian hacking group, a Russian cybersecurity consultant group 1 year later published a report called Equation Group: Questions and Answers. This report alleges that there is a Western hacking group. The allegations in this report are that this hacking group is hacking into Russia and China and the Middle East. Notably missing from the countries that this group hacks into, though, are the United States and the United Kingdom. This group also uses a level of sophistication in their hacking that far exceeded any of the Chinese or Russian state actors were capable of. Like, there's a crazy allegation in this report that claims that this group had the ability to reflash hard drive firmware, something you'd only be able to do if you had firmware signing keys from Toshiba, Samsung, Seagate, Western Digital, and other hard drive manufacturers that wouldn't want to give those keys up. This capability would give this group the ability to implant malware so deep on your computer that reinstalling the operating system wouldn't get rid of it. The hard drive firmware would just reinstall the backdoor on the system. The Russian consultancy said that the only way to be sure that this malware was gone from your system was to destroy the hard drive. I don't think it's a coincidence that a US cybersecurity company published details about a Russian state hacking group, and then 1 year later, a Russian cybersecurity company posted details about a US state hacking group. Some people view this one as retaliation for this one. Look, there's a reason why we have the founder of BugCrowd publicly tweeting out saying that we've been engaged in cyber warfare for decades. These reports have been updated and they've become more and more detailed over the years, but for the most part, they all follow the exact same formula, with maybe the one exception of the allegations the Russian cybersecurity company made about US state hackers. Almost all of these hacking groups follow the same formula of start with spear phishing, get access to an employee's laptop, and then start going after build servers, MySQL servers, Active Directory servers, Tomcat servers, unpatched end-days. So many different services that on the inside of a network are just designed to run insecurely. But what I want to put focus on is what I mentioned earlier, that these reports have no mention whatsoever of attacking organizations' cloud infrastructure, and that is crazy to me. AWS launched in 2006. Netflix started transferring all of their infrastructure into Amazon in 2008. In the early 2010s, a lot of companies that popped up then from day one never ran any of those servers on anything other than the public cloud. But for some reason, seemingly the most well-funded hacking groups on the planet just weren't going after these cloud resources. Okay, what about Metasploit? There is a cloud directory in the auxiliary modules in Metasploit, but it only lists one of the major 3 cloud providers. And the capabilities are limited to listing S3 buckets, listing IAM, and listing EC2 instances. They They are very primitive information gathering API calls. Cloud exploitation is just missing from the platform. Even to this day, it's just not there. So what's going on? Is our detection capability just not good enough to see this activity? Are the hacking groups not caught up? Or are we just not talking about it? Here's a fun fact. In 2020, I did a whole black hat talk on privilege escalation and lateral movement in Google Cloud. So to recap, we started with a base identity in BBS2 that had act as on the project. We then used that permission to gain access to every service account in this project via cloud functions. One of the service accounts in BBS2 had an owner role, which allowed us to elevate privileges in the BBS2 project. A different service account had a role binding into BBS3. This allowed us to use act as to take control of all the service accounts in BBS3. One of the service accounts we found in BBS3 had an organizational role binding, and this allowed us to take control of the entire org. Believe me, these attacks are very possible and in many cases very easy, if not easier, to pull off. Why don't we see more of it in the reports? I want to show you something kind of subtle. In 2016, Crowdstrike, the same company that refused to give any information about Operation Aurora back in 2010, published a detailed report about the DNC hack by the Russian government. They showed the malware that the Russians were using, they showed the source code, and they walked through in an extreme level of detail how all of the privilege escalation and hacking took place, but still no mention of the word cloud. But then, in 2020, this document got updated. The GRU stole approximately 300 gigabytes of data through the DNC cloud-based account. Then, this document references another document, the 2019 Special Counsel Report on Russian election interference. In this entire report, cloud computing is mentioned exactly one time. GRU officers hacked into the DNC account hosted on a cloud computing service. On September 20th, 2016, the GRU generated copies of the DNC data using functions that allowed users to produce backups, referred to as snapshots. The GRU stole snapshots by moving them into an account they controlled. From there, the copies moved to GRU-controlled computers. The GRU stole approximately 300 gigabytes of data from the DNC cloud-based account. There it is, the first instance in any of these documents that I could find of a state actor navigating a cloud API and exfiltrating data without the traditional means of lateral movement. What I mean by that is this method of stealing the data with snapshots did not involve dropping malware onto all of the services in the cloud and manually copying the files out of the running systems. No, this technique of exfiltration involved just natively invoking cloud APIs to download the data without having to run malware on the servers. I want to show you why I think this trend is only going to become more and more popular, and why I think in a lot of cases it's actually easier than the traditional form of hacking that we've seen for the last 10 years. Okay, before I jump into cloud hacking, I want to talk about something called Zero Trust. Zero Trust is a term that Google coined in a white paper that I'm not going to be able to fully do justice, so go read the Zero Trust white paper if you want to know all of the details. But at a high level, the idea behind Zero Trust is dissolving this network barrier that divides the trusted and untrusted. And rather than having a privileged network that runs all of our vulnerable services, we front all of our services with single sign-on and secured trusted API gateways, and we lean fully into cloud and SaaS rather than relying on network controls. The ideas behind Zero Trust are becoming so popular that not only are lots of tech companies adopting this methodology, but our government has adopted a Zero Trust model and has started to move some of their infrastructure over to Zero Trust. This erodes a lot of the lateral movement and privilege escalation that's done traditionally and makes the traditional form of hacking a lot more challenging. But With that context, I want to show you a really effective method for privilege escalating and moving laterally in the cloud without depending on a trusted network to do your hacking. I'm going to break cloud APIs into 3 main categories. APIs that allow you to manage data, APIs that allow you to run code, and APIs that allow you to manage permissions. Hey Google, how do you spell permissions?
Permissions is spelled P-E-R-M-I-S-S-I-O-N-S.
Before we get to any of these capabilities, we need to start with an initial foothold. So I'm going to give you 2 ways that you can get your initial foothold relatively easy in the cloud. The first is just through phishing. Some cloud providers provide a relatively easy way to perform something called OAuth phishing. OAuth phishing is taking advantage of one of these OAuth prompts that allow users to delegate their permissions to a third party. Basically, the idea is you send a phishing email to your victim, enticing them to click an OAuth allow grant that just immediately gives you an access key with all of that user's permissions. You can then use that access key to talk to the public cloud and start interacting with these 3 categories. The second way that you can get your initial foothold is to just find a credential laying around somewhere, and that is a lot easier than it sounds. You can find cloud credentials on GitHub, Pastebin, VirusTotal, package managers, Docker Hub, APKs in the Play Store, Electron apps, inside IoT devices. I remember a couple years ago, a friend and myself found a Google Cloud key inside of his Tesla. No, I don't mean in his trunk. I mean, we pulled the firmware out of his Tesla, and inside the firmware was a Google Cloud API key that was presumably replicated to all the make and models that were produced that year. Our push to move to the cloud has caused this tidal wave of credentials to just leak out all over the place. And then you can use those credentials the same way you can use the OAuth phishing access token to talk directly to the cloud API. Okay, so that's how we get our foothold. The next step is to figure out what type of access our credential actually has. For example, if our credential gives us the ability to manage data, and that could be something like reading from RDS, S3, ECR containers, BigQuery, Spanner, taking snapshots, basically anything that allows us to download data out of the cloud, that fits into this first category. If you have this level of permission, you can pull all of that data out of the cloud and start sifting through it for more cloud credentials. More often than not, somewhere in some database or some S3 bucket, you're going to find another access token that'll allow you to expand the capabilities that you started with. Managed data also includes being able to write to those data sources. So you might be able to, for example, write to an ECR registry, which would then enable you to potentially run code. So you might be able to run code through managing data, but you can also run code through APIs that are designed to allow you to facilitate running code. Those APIs could include things like managing EC2 instances, managing Lambdas, managing Kubernetes clusters, managing cloud build, basically any API that might enable you to run code on some instance or serverless infrastructure that might in itself have an instance profile attached to it. So in the world of AWS, running instances can be assigned their own sets of roles and permissions. The way those running instances are able to access those roles are through something called the Metadata API. The Metadata API is an internal API that all cloud providers have adopted that allow running instances to query in real time and pull a credential that matches all of the permissions that were assigned to that instance. So if you're able to run code or manage data that could ultimately be ran as code, you can manipulate that code to send an HTTP request to the Metadata API and return a cloud key to you that has all the permissions that that instance was assigned. Then you can add those credentials that came from the Metadata API to the list of credentials you already have that you've gotten through pulling all of the data looking for credentials and through your initial foothold. And you can repeat the process over again. Find new data that you're able to manage. Find new code that you're able to run with the credentials that you just found from the first 2 steps. And that finally takes me to the third capability in the cloud, and that's the ability to manage permissions. That could include things like creating new roles, assigning those roles to existing users. It could also include include things like assume role or act as or token creator. These are capabilities built into the cloud that allow one identity to take on all of the permissions of another identity. It's basically a way to privilege escalate by design in the cloud. And with that capability, without having to add any new credentials to the credentials you've already found, you can elevate the permissions of the identities that you've already taken control of. And that's pretty much it. You just keep repeating the process over and over again, and every time you get a new role or permission, you use that role or permission to pull more data, run more code, manage more permissions, until ultimately you've taken control of the entire cloud. Here's the kicker. To do all of this, you can use the command line tools provided to you from the cloud providers. You don't need a malware framework. You don't need to drop a bunch of malware on a bunch of running instances. Many of these command line tools actually enable you to manage multiple credentials and multiple identities inherent to their functionality. And so in a lot of ways, this style of hacking is more stealthy. It doesn't leave little malware fingerprints all over the things you're hacking into that can be used to trace back to you. And to be perfectly honest, the defenders, the people running incident response, have not caught up to detecting these types of attacks. So in many ways, this playground of hacking is ripe for abuse. In some cases, it's easier to pull off than traditional hacking, and traditional hacking is becoming more and more difficult as more and more companies start adopting zero trust models. So this is my prediction. Over the next 10 or 20 years, we are going to see state-sponsored hackers become more and more fluent with navigating privilege escalation and lateral movement in a cloud environment. Our consultants and pen testers are also not caught up to this style of attacking, but we're starting to see little clues that there are certain state-sponsored hackers that know how to do this stuff and are starting to do it in the wild. I don't think it's going to be a one-to-one replacement either. I think these capabilities are going to augment the capabilities that these hackers already have at their disposal. But with the whole world moving to the public cloud, they're not going to have a choice but to adopt this style of hacking at some point. That's all I've got.